The Plaistow Case, a Victorian domestic tragedy. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Acknowledgements. This book deals with a real tragedy that occurred in 1895 and with the lives of real people whose actions and losses still echo across generations. I want to acknowledge, first and foremost, Emily Coombes, whose life has too often been reduced to a single moment or a single image. She was a person before she was a case, and she deserves to be remembered with dignity. I also acknowledge that descendants, extended family members, and communities connected to this history may still be living today, including in Australia. This book was written with an awareness of that continuity. It is not intended to sensationalize, accuse, or assign moral judgment beyond what is established in the historical record. My aim has been to approach this story with care, restraint, and humanity, to examine what happened without turning suffering into spectacle, and to resist the temptation to simplify complex lives into villains or curiosities. Where interpretation appears, it is offered cautiously and in good faith, grounded in historical context rather than modern certainty. Where facts are stated, they are drawn from available public records and reputable secondary sources. If this book causes discomfort, that discomfort arises from the reality of the events themselves, not from any desire to provoke or exploit. I hope readers will understand it as an attempt to bear witness responsibly, to tell a difficult story in a way that honors those who lived it, and those who may still carry its legacy. Author's note. This story is often told as a freakish Victorian nightmare, a mother dead upstairs, a locked door, two boys spending money in the city as if nothing had happened. That version is not wrong. But it is incomplete. Because when a crime becomes a headline, it also becomes a tool. People use it to prove whatever they already believe, about children, about mothers, about the city, about morality, about bad seeds, about modern life. The Plaistow horror has been used that way since the moment it entered print. This book refuses that. It does not treat the Coombes case as entertainment dressed up as history. It does not treat the boys as demons or curiosities. And it does not treat Emily Coombes as a plot device. It is a narrative reconstruction based on the historical record, written with the understanding that the record is both powerful and limited. Sources and method. Where possible, this book draws on contemporary newspaper reporting, with full awareness of Victorian sensationalism and moralising. Surviving summaries of court proceedings and later historical accounts. Institutional and biographical records relating to the later lives of Robert and Nathaniel Coombes, including their emigration to Australia and wartime service, were documented. The record provides dates, locations, and the skeleton of events. What it cannot provide, what no source can fully provide, is a complete trustworthy map of private interior life. For that reason, this book uses careful, historically grounded inference only where it is justified by context. It avoids claiming certainty about emotions, motives, or private conversations unless such details are recorded in the sources. What psychology means here. This is a true crime narrative, but it is not a diagnostic text. When the book discusses psychological concepts, shock, denial, compartmentalization, emotional regulation, it does so to make sense of behaviour, not to excuse it and not to declare a definitive clinical explanation. The Victorian era had its own psychological language, moral insanity, degeneracy, depravity, and part of this story is how those labels were used to stabilize public fear. This book treats such language with caution. It is possible to name mechanisms without turning them into a verdict. It is possible to acknowledge development and dysfunction without stripping away responsibility. Why this story still matters. If the Coombes case continues to haunt readers, it is not because it is typical. It is because it disturbs something we rely on, the belief that homes are inherently safe, and that children are inherently legible. This case cracked both beliefs. The most unsettling detail is not simply that a boy killed his mother. It is what followed, days lived beneath a locked room. That is not supernatural. It is human psychology under extreme rupture, operating without the containment and regulation that should have been present. That is why the case has remained in cultural memory. And that is why it still lands hard, especially on parents. A word about Emily Coombes. In many retellings, Emily Coombes disappears into a single image, the body upstairs. This book has tried to keep her present as a person. She is not only a victim, she is a woman living inside the constraints of her era: illness, widowhood, motherhood, limited social support. She deserves to be remembered not only for how she died, but for the life she lived and the labor she carried. What you should feel. This book does not ask the reader for fascination. It asks for attention. If you feel horror, you are responding appropriately to a horror. If you feel anger, grief, disgust, or fear, especially fear as a parent, those feelings are part of what this case exposes: the closeness of domestic catastrophe, the thinness of the line between ordinary days and unimaginable ones. And if you feel the urge to reach for easy answers, demons, monsters, bad blood, this book invites you to pause. Because the most frightening truth in this story is also the most ordinary: a door can be locked, and life can continue downstairs. Prologue: The Locked Room. The house was too quiet. That was the first thing the neighbors noticed. Not the smell, not the locked door upstairs, not the absence of the woman who lived there. It was the quiet. In a street where voices carried through thin walls and children were rarely still, the Coombes house seemed to have withdrawn from the world. Emily Coombes had not been seen for days. At first, no one thought much of it. Respectable women disappeared briefly all the time, visiting relations, resting after illness, keeping to their rooms. Emily was not young, and she was often unwell. Her sons said she was indisposed. They spoke politely. They did not appear distressed. The boys were seen, however. They were everywhere. They were seen buying sweets. Seen at the theatre. Seen at cricket matches. Seen boarding trains, flushed with the small, breathless excitement of freedom. They spent money with the careless confidence of children who do not yet understand consequence. To the shopkeepers and conductors of East London, they looked like what they were supposed to look like: two ordinary boys enjoying an unexpected holiday. No one thought to ask where their mother was. The house stood on a neat working-class street in Plaistow, brick-fronted, modest, respectable. The kind of place meant to hold a family securely, to keep danger outside and order within. Curtains were drawn. The front door was shut. Nothing about it announced catastrophe. Inside, the rooms were tidy. Downstairs, life appeared to continue as normal. The boys slept, ate, came and went. Plates were washed. Shoes were left by the door. The ordinary signs of domestic routine remained intact, as if nothing fundamental had shifted. Upstairs, the door to Emily Coombes's bedroom was locked. Behind it, time had stopped. When the truth finally forced itself into the open, it would not arrive gently. It would arrive with the force of something long contained, through a door broken open, through the shocked silence of policemen, through the breathless horror of neighbors crowding the street. And when it came, it would not merely be a murder that confronted them. It would be the unsettling knowledge that two boys had lived, laughed, traveled, and spent money while their mother lay dead above their heads. The discovery would ripple outward, into newspapers, courtrooms, and drawing rooms, where the case would acquire a name designed to contain it: the Plaistow Horror. But before it was a horror, before it was a headline, before it became an argument about modern childhood and moral decay, it was a house with a locked room and a woman who had vanished too quietly. The police were called only after suspicion had ripened into certainty. The smell, sweet, unmistakable, no longer ignorable, had begun to seep beyond closed doors and good manners. When officers arrived, they were not expecting what they found. Even seasoned men, accustomed to domestic violence and sudden death, were unprepared for the calmness of the scene below and the finality of what waited above. The door upstairs resisted at first. When it was forced open, the room answered with a truth that could not be softened by euphemism or procedure. Emily Coombes lay on the bed where she had been killed days earlier. The air was heavy. The stillness was complete. It was immediately clear that this was no accident. Nor was it the kind of crime that fit comfortably into familiar categories. There was no sign of struggle extending through the house. No ransacked drawers. No intruder's trail leading in or out. The violence had occurred within the boundaries of the home, carried out by someone who did not flee afterward. Someone who stayed. Downstairs, two boys had slept and eaten and planned outings while their mother remained upstairs, unmoving. The contrast was so stark that it seemed to bend the mind around it, refusing easy explanation. When the boys were found, they did not resist. They did not deny. One of them, Robert, the elder by a year, spoke. He spoke plainly. He said he had done it. He was 13 years old. News of the crime traveled quickly, carried by the Victorian press with a mixture of fascination and dread. But what unsettled readers most was not simply that a child had committed murder. Children had always been capable of violence. History offered no shortage of proof. What made this case unbearable was what came after. The boys had not run away in terror. They had not collapsed into remorse. They had not been consumed by fear of discovery. Instead, they had stepped into the city and enjoyed themselves. They had gone on holiday. This detail, repeated, embellished, moralist, lodged itself in the public imagination like a splinter. It challenged everything Victorians believed they understood about childhood, conscience, and the natural order of the family. Mothers were meant to nurture. Sons were meant to depend. The home was meant to be a refuge. Here, the home had been the site of annihilation. And the children had walked away. As the case unfolded, commentators reached for explanations that would preserve the fragile boundaries of their world. Penny dreadfuls were blamed. Modern education was blamed. Urban life was blamed. Weak mothers, absent fathers, godlessness, sensation, all were placed on trial alongside the boy himself. Because if a child could commit such an act without immediate collapse, then something essential about society itself was at risk. The question beneath the horror was not only what happened. It was what kind of world produces this. This book is not an attempt to sensationalize that question. Nor is it an effort to solve the crime beyond what the historical record allows. The facts of Emily Coombes's death are known. The legal outcome is recorded. What remains uncertain, what must remain uncertain, is the interior world of the boy who killed her and the brother who lived alongside him. Instead, this is a study of a moment when a society confronted something it did not know how to name. A moment when childhood ceased to be safely innocent. A moment when crime, psychology, journalism, and fear collided in a small East London house with a locked door upstairs. To understand the Plaistow horror is not to excuse it. It is to trace how a single act exposed the anxieties of an age, and how those anxieties shaped the lives of two boys long after the headlines faded. The door upstairs was opened. But what followed did not close easily. And in many ways, it never has. Chapter 1, A Respectable Street. Plaistow was not a place that expected horror. It was the kind of district that had grown quickly and deliberately, brick by brick, street by street, on the eastern edge of London, where clerks, widows, and skilled workers tried to build lives that looked stable from the outside. The houses were modest but orderly, with small front gardens and narrow hallways designed to keep the chaos of the city at bay. Respectability mattered here. Curtains were drawn at the right hours. Doors were kept shut. Neighbors watched one another, not out of malice, but out of habit. The Coombes house did not stand out. That, in retrospect, was part of the problem. Emily Coombes lived there with her two sons after her husband's death. She was not wealthy, but she was not destitute. She managed the household on limited means, as thousands of women did, stretching money and patience with quiet determination. Her life was bounded by domestic responsibility, cooking, cleaning, disciplining, worrying. And worrying she did. Widowhood in late Victorian England was not simply a personal loss, it was a social vulnerability. A woman without a husband existed in a narrow space between independence and precarity. Emily had boys to raise, boys who were growing, restless, and no longer small enough to be easily managed. She was often ill. She was often tired. And like many women in her position, she carried the invisible strain of trying to hold together a household that society insisted was the foundation of moral order. Nothing about this was unusual. What would later shock the public was not that something went wrong in such a home, but how completely wrong, and how quietly. Because the violence that occurred in the Coombes house did not announce itself. There were no screams heard by neighbors, no shattered windows, no panicked flight into the street. Whatever happened between Emily and her son happened within the closed, ordinary boundaries of domestic life. And when it was over, the house did not erupt into chaos. It settled. That is what makes the case so disturbing, the speed with which catastrophe folded itself into routine. Downstairs, the rooms remained usable. Meals were eaten. Beds were slept in. Shoes were put on and taken off. The front door opened and closed. The house continued to perform normality convincingly enough that no one interfered. Upstairs, behind a locked door, a body lay decomposing. The Victorian home was supposed to be a moral engine, a place where children learned conscience through proximity to their parents, where mothers exerted a civilizing influence, where private life reinforced public order. The Coombes house inverted that ideal completely. It demonstrated, in the most literal way possible, that domestic space could absorb horror without visibly breaking. And that terrified people. Because if this could happen here, on a respectable street in a tidy house, beneath a roof that sheltered two boys who still went out to play, then the boundary between safety and danger was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. The neighbors trusted the signs they had been taught to trust. The boys appeared fed, clothed, and well-mannered. They did not seem distressed. They did not seem feral or unkempt or panicked. They were not running from the law. They were enjoying themselves. That enjoyment, innocent on the surface, grotesque beneath it, would later become the detail the press returned to again and again. It suggested not only crime, but a chilling absence of immediate remorse. It forced Victorians to confront the possibility that conscience was not automatic, not guaranteed by age or upbringing. The house, meanwhile, remained sealed. It held its secret until smell and suspicion overcame politeness. Until the body asserted itself. Until the locked door could no longer do its work. And when that door was finally forced, it did more than reveal a crime scene. It shattered the belief that childhood, by its nature, was incapable of sustaining such deliberate, sustained denial. The question that followed, how could they live like that, would echo through newspapers, courtrooms, and scientific debates for years. But before it became a national question, it was a local one. A quiet street. A tidy house. A mother unseen. And two boys who went out each day and came home again, passing beneath the room where their mother lay, as if the house itself had agreed to keep their secret. Chapter 2, The Boys. If the house was the first shock, the boys were the second. Because the public wanted them to look like monsters. It would have been easier if they had. Easier if they had been visibly wild, dirty, snarling, cruel-eyed little creatures that could be safely placed outside the category of normal child. Victorian England liked its boundaries clear. It liked evil to look like evil. But when people saw Robert and Nathaniel Coombes, what unsettled them most was how ordinary they appeared. Two boys. Schoolboys. The sort of children who existed everywhere in London. Thin legs, quick movements, faces still not fully formed into adulthood. They did not carry obvious villainy in their features. They did not move through the world as if they were hunted. They moved through it as if it belonged to them. Robert. Robert was the elder, 13 years old. At that age, a boy exists at an uncomfortable threshold. Still a child in law and in social imagination, yet old enough to be seen as capable of intent. Old enough to be expected to control himself. Old enough to understand, at least in part, the consequences of violence. And if he did understand, then the question became darker. What did he feel? Those who later tried to explain Robert reached for labels. They described him as clever, spirited, precocious. In some accounts he appears as a boy drawn to stories, sensational tales, lurid adventures, fantasies of boldness. In others he is simply restless, chafing against authority, moving through the world with the arrogant confidence of someone who believes he will not be stopped. These explanations were comforting in their way because they offered a cause. Victorian society needed a cause. It did not want to confront the possibility that a child might commit murder without a neat narrative attached: poverty, cruelty, madness, corruption. The age demanded reasons, because reasons could be turned into warnings. Robert, however, resisted simple explanation. Even in the record, he appears shifting, sometimes composed, sometimes strangely detached, sometimes childlike, sometimes unervingly direct. People who met him were struck by his ability to answer questions without flinching. Not with bravado exactly, but with a kind of practiced steadiness. Steadiness in a 13-year-old is unsettling, because it feels too close to adult certainty. Nathaniel. Nathaniel was younger, 12. The younger brother in such cases is often made into a symbol, either the innocent dragged along or the hidden accomplice. The public imagination rarely allows him to remain simply what he is, a child caught in something too large to understand fully, yet too close to deny. Nathaniel's role would become a pivot point for outrage and pity. If he was innocent, then the crime became a tragedy of contamination, one boy's evil staining the other's childhood. If he was complicit, then the crime became something worse, a shared reality, a domestic conspiracy carried out not by men, but by children. In the way the case was reported, Nathaniel often appeared quieter, more passive. But passivity can be its own kind of participation. Silence can be agreement. Fear can become obedience. And sometimes, in families, obedience is survival. The truth, like so much in domestic crime, sat somewhere between the stories people wanted to tell. Brothers. Brothers exist in their own private world. They develop languages that parents do not fully hear, loyalties that outlast common sense, rivalries sharp enough to cut. They share secrets. They share games. They share punishments. They share the strange intimacy of growing up under the same roof, fed by the same hands, disciplined by the same voice. Robert and Nathaniel had that intimacy. It mattered, because the crime did not end when their mother died. Something continued afterward, and it continued in a house they inhabited together. Whatever happened in the days that followed, whatever choices were made, whatever silences were agreed upon, required a form of shared understanding, even if that understanding was imperfect. And yet, in public imagination, it was often Robert who carried the full weight of intention, while Nathaniel was treated as shadow, either victim of his brother or mirror of him. Victorians were uncomfortable with the idea of two boys sharing such a secret. It suggested a partnership beyond adult oversight, a domestic space where children could create their own moral universe. That idea, the private moral universe of children, was at the heart of the panic the case created. The Victorian fear of the boy. In late Victorian London, the figure of the boy carried a particular anxiety. Childhood was being reimagined in the period, no longer simply small adulthood, but a distinct stage requiring guidance, schooling, supervision. Reformers spoke of saving children from the streets. Newspapers fretted about juvenile delinquency. The city produced boys in abundance: errand boys, factory boys, street sellers, boys in uniform, boys with pennies, boys with nowhere to go. And alongside these real boys existed a second species, boys of sensation. Boys who devoured penny papers and lurid serials. Boys who imagined themselves as detectives, pirates, criminals. Boys who learned, through print, that excitement could be purchased for a halfpenny, that violence could be thrilling when safely contained in fiction. When the Coombes case broke, these fears rushed to fill the gap between act and explanation. The public did not want to think about illness in a household, grief, resentment, suffocation, ordinary domestic despair. Those were too close to home. It preferred a story about corrupting literature and the dangers of imagination. Because if stories were to blame, then the world could be fixed by banning the stories. But the boys were not made of paper. They were made of flesh, nerve, and ordinary human need. They lived with a mother who was often unwell, in a house that demanded obedience, in a society that offered boys both discipline and temptation in equal measure. They were old enough to feel trapped, young enough to believe consequences could be dodged. And somewhere in that dangerous space between childhood and accountability, Robert crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Seen in the street. This was what made the case so eerie. People saw them after. Neighbors saw the boys in the street and thought nothing. Shopkeepers sold them sweets. Conductors took their pennies. Other children played alongside them. Adults watched them pass and did not feel the need to intervene. Because the boys did not carry their secret like a wound. They carried it like a locked door. And in those first days, the door held. It held long enough for the boys to move through London as if on holiday, free, exhilarated, unmoored from ordinary supervision. It held long enough for routine to disguise atrocity. It held long enough to force a question that still raises the hairs on the back of the neck. What does a child do with freedom, when freedom arrives through violence? The next chapter begins where answers become harder, because it is not about motive or guilt alone. It is about the moment when a home becomes a crime scene. And the moment when a boy decides, not just to kill, but to keep living as if the killing were something that could be folded neatly away upstairs. Chapter 3, The Night. No one knows exactly how the argument began. That uncertainty sits at the center of the case like a hollow space, an absence that cannot be filled, only circled. What survives are fragments, later testimony, police reconstruction, inferences drawn from what was found. There is no dramatic final quarrel preserved in dialogue. No shouted threats overheard through walls. The violence occurred within the ordinary intimacy of a home. Emily Coombes was in her bedroom when her son came to her. It was evening. The house was otherwise quiet. Nothing suggests panic or intrusion. Whatever was said between them belonged to the private language of family, commands, refusals, resentment, fatigue. The kind of exchange that happens in countless households without consequence. This time, it ended differently. Robert had a knife. It was not a weapon brought from outside, not a symbolic instrument of crime. It was a domestic object, taken from within the house itself. That detail mattered deeply to Victorian commentators later, because it collapsed the boundary between home and danger. The means of violence had not been imported. It had already been there. Emily was stabbed while in her bed. The act was sudden, close, and irreversible. There was no suggestion of a prolonged struggle that moved through the house. The violence did not spill outward. It remained contained within the room, as if even in death the domestic order tried to keep its shape. At some point during or after the act, Nathaniel was present. How present, whether as witness, accomplice, or terrified observer, would become one of the most contested questions of the case. What is clear is that the younger boy did not flee. He did not raise the alarm. He did not run into the street screaming. He stayed. That choice, whether born of fear, loyalty, shock, or something harder to name, meant that what happened next became a shared reality. Emily Coombes died in that room. And then, crucially, the boys did not leave. After. Most murders are followed by chaos. Shouting. Running. The frantic need to escape what has just been done. Even criminals accustomed to violence often experience a moment of rupture, a collapse of the ordinary world that demands immediate response. Here, the rupture was sealed instead. The boys locked the bedroom door. This act, small, deliberate, almost mundane, is one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Locking a door is not dramatic. It is something done to preserve privacy, to keep things orderly, to prevent intrusion. In this context, it transformed the room into a boundary between two realities. Above the door, death, stillness, decomposition. Below the door, life continuing. The house was reorganized around the locked room. The boys moved through it as if the upper floor had ceased to exist. They slept. They ate. They planned. The body upstairs was not denied exactly, but it was postponed, deferred, placed beyond immediate reckoning. In psychological terms, this is sometimes described as compartmentalization. But that word is clinical and insufficient. What occurred was not merely a mental trick. It was a practical arrangement sustained over days. Every time the boys passed the staircase, they passed the truth. Every time they shut the front door behind them to go out, they left the truth alone in the house. Every time they returned, the house accepted them back without protest. This is where the creepiness deepens, not because of supernatural implication, but because of the normality of what followed. The days that followed. They did not clean the room. They did not attempt to dispose of the body. They did not confess. Instead, they turned outward. They spent money that belonged to the household. They bought food, sweets, tickets. They took trains. They went to the theatre. They went to cricket matches. They treated London as a playground briefly made available to them. The city cooperated. It always does. Cities do not ask children where their parents are. They accept coins and return change. They carry bodies anonymously through crowds. They allow horrors to move unnoticed so long as they wear ordinary faces. Back at the house, decomposition began its slow, unavoidable work. The locked room could not keep time from passing. It could only delay discovery. Smell crept outward. The body insisted on itself. Biology overruled secrecy. And still, the boys did not break. They did not go upstairs. They did not open the door. They did not surrender to panic. This endurance, the ability to live above a dead mother without immediate collapse, was what horrified Victorians most. It suggested not only violence, but a terrifying emotional economy, a child capable of sustaining denial long enough to enjoy himself. The public would later argue over why. They would blame books. They would blame illness. They would blame modern life, absent fathers, indulgent mothers, urban overstimulation. They would search desperately for explanations that kept the world legible. But the crime itself resists legibility, because it was not followed by madness. It was followed by routine. When the door failed, the locked door eventually stopped doing its work. The smell reached neighbors. Questions were asked. Politeness thinned. Authority was summoned. When the police arrived, They were not prepared for the disjunction they encountered, a house that looked lived in and a room that spoke of prolonged death. The moment the door was forced, secrecy collapsed. But by then, the most unsettling fact was already fixed. For days, two boys had known exactly what lay upstairs, and had chosen to go on living as if the house could hold that knowledge without consequence. That choice is the heart of the Plaistow horror. Not the knife. Not even the killing. But the decision to lock a door and treat death as something that could be postponed, while life, sweet, reckless, unencumbered, went on downstairs. The next chapter follows the boys into the city, where freedom and horror walked side by side, unnoticed. Because if the crime began in a bedroom, its meaning was forged in public, on trains, in theaters, at cricket grounds, where no one yet knew what kind of holiday these boys were really taking. Chapter 4, Upstairs. A locked door is not unusual in a house. It is, in fact, one of the smallest tools of civilization: wood latch key. Privacy. Boundary. The quiet agreement that some things are not for everyone's eyes. Bedrooms, especially, are meant to be protected spaces. In Victorian homes, a closed bedroom door carried a particular meaning: propriety, illness, rest. Which is why, at first, the locked room upstairs did not alarm anyone. It fit too easily into what people already believed. Emily Coombes was unwell. The boys said so. The boys said she was resting. They spoke with the smooth confidence of children who understand that adults want reassurance more than they want detail. And adults, especially neighbors, were trained to accept the language of propriety. You didn't pry into another woman's bedroom. You didn't demand proof that an illness was real. You didn't knock insistently if a household claimed to be managing its own affairs. This was how violence hid in plain sight. Not through invisibility, but through custom. The house as a stage. Downstairs, the house performed normality. That performance is what makes the case feel so wrong to the modern mind. We want crime to distort the scene immediately, to leave marks, mess, confession, collapse. We expect disorder, because disorder signals danger. But the Coombes house did not erupt into visible disorder. It rearranged itself around a single terrible fact and kept going. The boys continued to use the downstairs rooms. They ate and slept there. They moved in and out of the front door. They existed publicly, as boys still tethered to a home. And the home cooperated, because homes do not speak. The kitchen still smelled of food at certain hours. The scullery still held water. The table still held plates. Clothes still lay where they had been dropped. The familiar clutter of a lived-in place remained. It is hard to hold horror in the mind while looking at a normal chair. That is part of why domestic crime is so unsettling. It requires us to accept that the most ordinary objects, teapot, towel, bedsheet, can exist beside death without changing their shape. Upstairs, behind the locked door, the bedroom had become a sealed pocket of time. The choice that follows the killing. There is a moment after violence when a person must decide what reality they will live in. For an adult offender, that moment often produces panic. Run, hide, destroy evidence, fabricate a story. For a child, especially a child in a house, there is another option, far more chilling. Make it a secret and keep living. Locking the door was not only a practical act. It was a decision about how to continue. It was the creation of two worlds. The world where their mother was dead, and the world where they were still boys who could buy sweets and go to the theater. Once that division was created, everything depended on maintaining it. And maintaining it meant not opening the door. It meant walking past it. It meant using the stairs without looking at the landing too long. It meant adjusting subtly to a new geography of the home. The upstairs became dangerous, forbidden, untouchable, not because a parent had declared it so, but because the boys had. This is where the creepiness deepens. Not in the gore. In the management. In the way the house was quietly reorganized around a locked room like a family reorganizes around an illness, pretending nothing is changing as everything changes. Smell and time. A human body does not stay politely quiet. Death has its own timetable, and it does not respect children's fantasies of control. At first, perhaps, the room was simply closed. Then it became noticeable that it remained closed. Then, inevitably, there was smell. Smell does not arrive dramatically. It seeps. It makes itself known at the edges first, a faint sweetness, a wrongness in the air that is easy to blame on drains or rubbish or damp weather. Victorian London had no shortage of unpleasant smells. Streets carried the stink of horse dung and soot. Houses held the stale breath of coal fires and overcrowding. This was what allowed the early stages of decomposition to hide. But decomposition wins. The smell grows stronger and more specific. It begins to cling to fabrics. It creeps out from beneath doors. It makes itself present in the staircase air, then in the hallway, then in the mind. People start noticing not just the smell itself, but the strangeness of how the house is being lived in. Why is the mother never seen? Why do the boys seem so free? Why is the upstairs kept so closed? Questions start as murmurs. Murmurs become suspicions. Suspicion becomes a kind of moral pressure. Eventually someone does what Victorian neighborliness both encouraged and resisted: they interfere. This is the moment when the private becomes public. And in Victorian England, nothing traveled faster than a domestic scandal. The bedroom as a symbol. To Victorians, the bedroom was not merely a room. It was a symbol. It was the place of lawful intimacy. The place of maternal rest. The place where illness was tended, births occurred, prayers were whispered, death sometimes arrived quietly under a quilt. The idea that a mother could be killed in her own bed, and left there, locked away like an inconvenience, struck at the heart of what the home was supposed to be. It wasn't only murder. It was desecration of the domestic order. This is why the case became so enormous. Because it didn't belong safely to the criminal underworld. It didn't happen in an alley among strangers. It happened in a bedroom in a respectable street. It happened in a space Victorian culture considered morally protected. And the perpetrators were not men from the outside. They were the children the home was meant to shape. The silence below. Downstairs, the boys lived inside the gap between what had happened and what had been discovered. It was, in a grim way, a kind of holiday, because rules had loosened. Mother's voice was gone. The ordinary supervision of the household had vanished. Money could be taken. Days could be spent outside. Bedtimes could be stretched. Adventures could be had. But it was not freedom the way we usually imagine freedom. It was freedom built on a locked door. Every outing began and ended in the shadow of what lay above them. That is what makes their days afterwards feel almost unreal, like a story told by boys to themselves, a temporary suspension of consequence. The house, meanwhile, continued its quiet performance. It held the secret until it could not. And when it finally failed, when smell and suspicion overcame politeness and habit, the locked room would be opened not only by force, but by the collective need of a community to name what it feared. Because as long as the door remained shut, the horror remained possible but unconfirmed. Once it opened, the horror became fact. And facts, in Victorian London, became headlines. Chapter 5, Holidays. What the boys did after the murder was, in its own way, more scandalous than the murder itself. Not because the outings were extravagant, they weren't. Not because London had never seen children spending pennies on pleasures, it had. But because of what the outings implied, a kind of ordinary enjoyment occurring in the shadow of an extraordinary act. The public could imagine a child striking in anger. People could understand violence as a sudden storm. What they struggled to understand was the weather that followed: clear skies, laughter, movement through the city, the appearance of a holiday. Victorian England had a deep belief in the moral mechanics of remorse. It expected guilt to be visible. It expected the wrongdoer to break quickly under the weight of what they had done. The Coombes boys did not break in the way the public expected. They went out. London as playground. In the 1890s, London was a city that offered entertainment cheaply and in abundance. It was a place where the poorest could still buy moments of escape: music halls, cheap seats, penny sweets, tram rides that felt like travel, railway platforms full of possibility. For boys, the city was a kind of map of temptations. Every street held something to watch, something to taste, something to do. The adult city, its commerce, its crowds, its noise, did not shut children out. It swallowed them and let them move through it freely, provided they had coins in their pockets. Robert had coins. And the crucial detail, one that would later inflame outrage, was that the coins came from the household. From the money meant to keep the home alive. From whatever cash their mother had kept for food, rent, daily survival. It was not simply theft. It was the conversion of domestic necessity into pleasure. That is why the story felt obscene. They were spending what should have sustained the dead woman upstairs. The outings. The record of their movements, pieced together through tickets, witness sightings, and later reporting, reads like a child's itinerary of freedom. They went to see cricket. They went to places where crowds gathered to watch men hit and throw and run, where applause rose in waves. There is something particularly eerie about this detail. Sport, so public and spirited, juxtaposed with a locked room at home where death lay quiet. They went to the theatre. Theatre was not always grand. There were cheap entertainments, music hall shows, variety acts, places where a boy could sit in the dark and watch a world unfold that was louder and brighter than his own. For Victorians later, this was easy to moralize. Theatre as temptation, theatre as stimulation, theatre as one more corrupting influence. But for the boys, it may have been simpler. It was something to do. They traveled. Trains mattered in this story because trains were the great Victorian symbol of modern movement, speed, escape, the ability to leave one place and become untraceable in another. For an adult criminal, railways were a route out. For a child, railways were adventure. The boys became, briefly, little travelers. That, too, became scandal. Because travel suggested planning. It suggested intention beyond a single impulsive act. It suggested a boy capable of thinking in days rather than minutes. And the more the public believed the boys had planned, the more terrified they became. The face they wore. To everyone who encountered them, ticket collectors, shopkeepers, other children, the boys looked normal. That is one of the cruel tricks the world plays. It does not mark a child as dangerous. The cashier does not see a murderer. The conductor does not see a secret. People see what they expect to see. Boys on an outing, perhaps unusually free, perhaps slightly bold, but not alarming. This ordinary appearance protected them. It allowed the holiday to continue. It allowed them to walk through London with their secret intact. It also deepened the horror later, when everyone looked back and realized, we saw them. We spoke to them. We took their money. And we did not know. That creates a communal shiver, the sense that evil can brush past you in daylight, in the shape of something familiar. The strange economy of children. Adults imagine children as incapable of sustaining deception for long. But children deceive constantly in small ways. They hide sweets. They lie about broken cups. They invent illnesses to avoid school. Deception is part of childhood, not because children are wicked, but because childhood is a negotiation with authority. In this case, that ordinary childhood skill was turned to a darker use. The boys said their mother was unwell. That phrase, so ordinary, did enormous work. It explained her absence. It protected the locked door upstairs. It allowed them to move freely without attracting immediate suspicion. Most neighbors would not demand to see a sick woman. Most adults would not insist on entering an upstairs bedroom. Most would accept the familiar language of illness and privacy. This wasn't a brilliant lie. It was a socially convenient one. Victorian respectability helped them. And that, too, haunted the public, the idea that politeness and propriety can become accomplices. The pressure of time. Even as they moved through London, time was doing something inside the house. The body was changing. Air was thickening. Smell was strengthening. The locked room was becoming less containable. Whatever sense of holiday the boys felt was, whether they realized it or not, running on borrowed time. It is possible they knew this. It is possible they did not. Children can believe consequences can be delayed indefinitely, as if the world must wait for them to be ready. They live in a present tense more intensely than adults do. They can push the future away with astonishing confidence. But biology does not negotiate. The body upstairs was making itself known. What people needed this to mean. When the story broke, newspapers seized on the holiday. They described the boys' outings in detail, where they went, what they spent, what they watched, what they ate, because those details were vivid and public. They could be narrated. They could be moralist. And because they created a contrast so stark it felt unnatural. A dead mother. A locked room. Two boys on holiday. This contrast did something to Victorian readers. It forced them to confront the possibility that childhood was not automatically innocent. That a child could commit violence and then step into pleasure without the immediate collapse of conscience adults expected. To preserve their world, many people reached for explanations that kept the case from feeling like a crack in reality. The boys must have been influenced by violent literature. The boys must have been morally corrupted by the city. The boys must have been abnormal. The boys must have been other. Because if the boys were simply boys, then the horror could happen anywhere. And that was the thought Victorian London could not tolerate. The return home. However bright the city was, the holiday ended where it began, at the front door. Each day the boys returned to the house. Each day they passed beneath the locked room. Each day the secret remained intact, until smell and suspicion overcame the social habits that had protected them. The holiday did not end in a dramatic chase. It ended in a slow tightening of attention. A neighbor pausing a little longer. A question repeated. A smell no longer ignorable. And then finally, the step that turned private horror into public fact, the decision to involve the police. The next chapter is where the case snaps shut around them, where discovery happens, and London learns what those boys have been doing while the city sold them tickets and sweets. Chapter 6. Discovery. There is a moment in every notorious case when private horror becomes public fact. Before that moment, everything exists in a fog of possibility. Neighbors speculate. People notice oddities, but explain them away. Suspicion builds slowly, thickening like damp in a closed room. And because this is domestic life, because it is a home, custom and politeness do much of the work of delay. You do not barge into another family's house. You do not accuse children lightly. You do not insist on seeing a woman who is said to be resting. Not in Plaistow. Not in a street built on the fragile promise of respectability. But there are limits to politeness. And one of those limits is smell. The house begins to speak. At first, the smell would have been easy to mistake. Victorian London was a city of odors: coal smoke, horse manure, drains, stale cooking fat, damp wool drying near fires. Houses held their own private atmospheres, especially small houses where rooms were close and ventilation poor. A faint sweetness, a wrongness on the stairs, could be blamed on almost anything. But over time, smell becomes specific. It changes from unpleasant to unmistakable. It clings to clothing. It makes you step back from the threshold without knowing why. It forces itself into the mind and refuses to be ignored. Alongside the smell were the other details, small accumulating oddities. Emily Coombes remained unseen. The boys seemed strangely untroubled. They came and went with unusual freedom. The upstairs remained closed, guarded by the language of illness and privacy. None of these alone demanded action. Together, they formed a shape no one wanted to name. The neighbors decide to interfere. In late Victorian neighborhoods, community surveillance was constant. People watched because they lived close. They listened because walls were thin. They knew who was sick, who was drunk, who was quarreling, who had money, who did not. This watchfulness was not always kindness. It could be gossip, judgment, cruelty. But it could also be a form of informal protection, especially for women and children. It is likely that concern first appeared as a question asked more than once: "Is your mother any better?" And then another: "May I see her?" And then, when the answers remained vague, a different kind of question, spoken more quietly: "Have you seen her at all?" The boys' responses, whatever their exact words, did not satisfy. And the smell, by now no longer ignorable, undermined every polite explanation. Eventually, someone took the step that transformed suspicion into authority. They called the police. The police arrive. When the police arrived at the Coombes house, they did not yet have the full horror in their minds. Police were accustomed to domestic trouble, assaults, drunken disputes, sudden deaths from illness, poverty's quiet tragedies. Even murder, though shocking, was not unheard of. But what they encountered here carried a particular wrongness. A house that appeared lived in. And yet a mother absent. Upstairs closed. Air that told a story the downstairs tried to deny. The police asked questions. They were not the kind of questions neighbors ask. They did not soften their tone with politeness. They did not accept resting as an answer without proof. They went upstairs. The locked door resisted. At that point, the case became irreversible. Because a locked door in a house where a woman has not been seen for days and the air stinks of death is not privacy. It is evidence. They forced it. The room. It is difficult to describe the moment a door opens on death without slipping into the lurid. But the historical record makes clear the essential facts. Emily Coombes lay dead in her bed. She had been dead for days. The body had begun the inevitable processes that make secrecy impossible. The room was not simply a scene of violence, it was a sealed environment where time had passed without intervention. The air was thick. The stillness was total. The smell, the thing that had pushed neighbors past politeness, now had its source. The police did not need to hunt for signs of intrusion. This was not a burglary gone wrong. This was not an unknown assailant fleeing in the night. The crime belonged to the house. And when a crime belongs to the house, it almost always belongs to those inside it. The question that followed. The discovery upstairs produced an immediate practical response: secure the scene, inform superiors, begin the inquiry. But it also produced a human response that, in this case, was stronger than usual. Where are the boys? Because the moment Emily Coombes's body was found, it was instantly clear that the house had not been abandoned in the days after her death. Downstairs had been used. Someone had eaten. Someone had slept. Someone had lived in the building while death lay above. The absence of the children became its own kind of evidence. If they were missing, they were either victims too, or they were part of the story. And almost immediately, London's imagination jumped to the darkest possibility: the search. Once the police understood that the boys were not in the house, the search began, not like a grand manhunt, but like the practical tracking of children who were known to have been spending money and moving through public places. Ticket collectors, shopkeepers, neighbors. Anyone who had seen the boys recently became a small piece of the puzzle. This is another thing Victorian cities did well: they gossiped efficiently. People remembered 2 boys. People remembered them buying sweets. People remembered them at entertainments. People remembered them traveling. And as these recollections stacked up, the case grew stranger. Because the picture that emerged was not of boys fleeing in terror. It was of boys on outings. The moment the story changed shape. The discovery of Emily Coombes's body did not remain local for long. In a city like London, the press was hungry, and certain stories were irresistible. A dead mother in a locked room would already have made news. But the detail that transformed this into national sensation was still forming. 2 boys had lived in the house afterward. 2 boys had moved through the city. 2 boys had spent money and enjoyed themselves. And the mother's body had been left upstairs. When the police moved to locate the boys, they were not only solving a crime. They were about to deliver a story to the public, a story that would strike at Victorian beliefs about childhood, morality, and the home. This was no longer simply a death. It was a rupture in the social imagination. And somewhere in London, 2 boys were still walking around in daylight while the city began to close its hand around them. The next chapter follows the search to its end: arrest, confession, and the moment the ordinary-looking boys become, overnight, symbols of something the age could not bear to face. Chapter 7: Confession. By the time the police began looking for the boys, the story had already started to change shape. In Plaistow, it was still a house, a smell, a locked door, and neighbors gathered in a tight, frightened knot on the pavement. But elsewhere, on tram lines, at ticket windows, in the blurred memory of shopkeepers, 2 boys had become something else, moving points on a map, leaving behind small traces of their freedom. Police work, especially in cases involving children, often moves through ordinary channels. Children do not have the sophisticated hiding instincts of adults. They go where they have wanted to go all along. They spend money where money is accepted. They travel along routes that feel like adventure rather than escape. And the boys had already been seen repeatedly, moving through London as if nothing had changed. So the search tightened. It became less about guessing and more about collecting: who had seen them where, at what hour, buying what, saying what. Each answer turned into another question, each citing another thread. The city, so good at anonymity, also had an opposite quality: it remembered the unusual. 2 boys alone with money, with time, with the lightness of a holiday, stood out just enough to be noticed. And then, as always happens, the running ended not with a chase but with a stop. A hand on a shoulder. A question asked in a tone that does not allow childish evasion. A moment when the boys understood, perhaps for the first time since the locked door upstairs, that the adult world had re-entered their story. The first questions. When children are confronted by authority, their responses are rarely theatrical. They do not usually deliver speeches. They glance at one another. They search faces for clues. They offer partial truths, small lies, rehearsed explanations. The police asked about their mother. Where was she? When had they last seen her? Why had she not been seen by anyone else? At first, the familiar phrase, "she is unwell," could do its work no longer. It had been designed for neighbors and propriety, not for policemen. Police questions have a different texture. They are not satisfied by vagueness. They repeat. They corner. They return to the same point until the speaker either answers or breaks. The boys were separated. This detail matters. In any shared secret, the bond between two people is part of the structure. Separate them, and the structure begins to wobble. A younger child, in particular, often relies on proximity to the older one, the one who leads, who speaks, who decides what is true. Separated, the younger is left alone with the full weight of what has happened. And fear does what it always does. It loosens the grip of loyalty. Robert speaks. When Robert finally spoke, what unsettled people later was not only what he said, but the manner in which he said it. The public wanted hysteria. They wanted a child collapsing, sobbing, begging. They wanted outward proof that conscience had been violently awakened. Instead, the story that emerged suggested something colder, that Robert could state what had happened with a disturbing steadiness, as if confession were simply the next practical step. He said he had killed his mother. He did not claim an unknown intruder. He did not invent a dramatic struggle with a villain. He did not set the blame on the city, or books, or bad companions. He named himself. For Victorians, this was terrifying. A child who confesses without a labyrinth of excuses undermines the comforting belief that wrongness must always be accompanied by obvious madness. It suggested intent. It suggested self-possession. It suggested that the boy had been living in a world where the locked door upstairs was not an unbearable horror but a manageable problem. The police, trained to search for adult deception, now had to handle a different kind of reality, a child describing domestic murder with the plainness of someone talking about a broken household object. Nathaniel's place in the story. Attention immediately turned to Nathaniel. Where had he been during the killing? What had he seen? What had he done afterward? The record would later wrestle with this because the public demanded clarity and the case refused to provide a neat, moral shape. Victorian readers wanted a clean split. One boy guilty, one boy innocent. One boy corrupt, one boy pure. One boy bad seed, one boy victim. But sibling reality does not obey public appetite. Nathaniel had lived under the same roof, walked past the same locked door, spent the same money, boarded the same trains. Even if he had not held the knife, he had been close enough to the truth to feel its heat. His silence, whether born of fear, obedience, shock, or something more complicated, became part of the story. And because he was 12, the world wanted to rescue him from meaning. It wanted to believe he could be pulled back into innocence. The city learns. Once the confession existed, everything accelerated. In a modern case, news travels fast. In Victorian London, it traveled in print. The press did not merely report crimes, it made them into narratives that served cultural anxieties. And this case arrived pre-made for the machinery of sensation. A mother dead in her bed. A locked room upstairs. Boys spending money and going to entertainments. A confession from a child. It had the dreadful simplicity of a nightmare. The boys were no longer simply two children who had moved through public spaces. Overnight, they became characters in a national drama. Their faces, their ages, their ordinary boy appearance became objects of fascination and dread. And with the confession, the public finally had permission to feel what had been building beneath the neighborhood's polite hesitation, horror without restraint. What confession does. Confession does not end a story. It begins a new one. Because once Robert admitted the killing, the question shifted from who did it, to what kind of child does this? And even more dangerously, could there be more? Victorian society did what societies always do when confronted by a crime that feels like an attack on the natural order. It searched for causes that could be controlled. The idea of a boy killing his mother was already unbearable. But the days afterward, the locked door, the holiday-like outings, made it feel as if morality itself had been suspended. So the next stage was not only legal. It was interpretive. Newspapers, reformers, and experts moved in, each trying to claim the case and explain it in a way that restored meaning to a world that suddenly felt unstable. The next chapter is where that begins in earnest. The headlines, the nicknames, the moral panic, and the way a single domestic killing becomes a national argument about childhood, influence, and modern life. Chapter 8. The Plaistow Horror. Once the body was found and the boys were in custody, London did what London always did with a story it couldn't bear to hold in silence. It turned it into a spectacle. The crime left the house and entered print. And once it entered print, it stopped being only a tragedy in Plaistow and became a national argument about childhood, morality, imagination, and what kind of creature a boy really is when adults aren't watching. The newspapers gave it a name that sounded like a hammer strike, the Plaistow Horror. And with that name came permission for the public to feel disgust, fear, fascination, and rage all at once. Not the murder, the days after. Reporters kept returning to the same detail, because it was the detail that made people's stomachs turn. They left her there. Not for minutes. Not in confusion. For days. A locked room upstairs. And downstairs, life continuing. This was the part that made people reach for the supernatural, even if they didn't believe in it. Because when the mind can't make something human-shaped, it tries to give it another shape. Demon, monster, corruption, possession, anything that keeps the horror at a safe distance from normal boyhood. Victorian language for this wasn't usually demons, not in polite print. It was words like unnatural, depraved, hardened, callous, without conscience, precocious in evil. Those phrases did a job. They weren't only describing the boys. They were protecting the reader from the thought that ordinary children could do this. The problem of their faces. Then came the second shock. They didn't look like what people wanted them to be. There's a cruel, persistent human desire for the face to confess. For evil to show itself in eyes, jaw, posture, so that the rest of us can feel safe in our own ability to recognize danger. But the Coombes boys were described, over and over, as ordinary. And ordinary was intolerable. So the press and the public tried to force meaning onto their bodies. If a boy didn't look monstrous, then people went hunting for signs: shifty, expressionless, too calm, too bright, too composed. If he cried, it was performative. If he didn't cry, it was proof of depravity. If he answered questions clearly, he was unnaturally self-possessed. If he seemed childish, he was coldly deceptive. In other words, whatever he did could be made to mean guilt. This is one of the most psychologically revealing things about public panic. It becomes a closed system. It doesn't interpret evidence, it consumes it. A boy who could live with it. The locked room upstairs became the central symbol, not just of crime but of a terrifying capacity, the ability to live beside death. Victorian commentators tried to imagine the daily experience. Did they hear the quiet of the house differently? Did they avoid that part of the staircase? Did they whisper about it? Did they joke? Did they feel fear at night? Did they sleep? And the reason these questions were asked obsessively is that they point to something deeper than motive. They point to conscience. Not conscience as theology, but conscience as the internal mechanism that makes a person unable to carry on. The public needed to believe that a person who did something that wrong would be psychologically punished immediately, by sleeplessness, by panic, by breakdown. When the story suggested the boys had instead experienced something like exhilaration, outings, entertainment, a brief holiday, people reacted as if a natural law had been violated. Not only a child killed, but a child killed and then continued. That's why the case felt haunted. Theories, explanations, and scapegoats. Once panic begins, it looks for an object to blame. And Victorian England had several favourites already waiting. Bad literature. This case became a lightning rod for the fear that cheap sensational stories, penny dreadfuls, crime tales, lurid serials, were teaching boys to enjoy violence and treat life like a plot. The argument wasn't subtle. Stories made them do it. Because if stories were to blame, the solution was simple: ban, censor, moralize. The modern city. London itself was put on trial. Crowds, anonymity, entertainment, trains, temptations everywhere, adults too busy to watch boys properly. The city becomes a corrupting machine in these narratives, turning children into strangers within their own homes. The mother. This is where Victorian cruelty often landed, on women. If a son became bad, people asked what his mother did wrong: too strict, too weak, too ill, too absent, too indulgent. Emily Coombes, the victim, could not speak, and so she could be shaped into whatever explanation the public needed. The child as other. And then the darkest explanation, that the boy wasn't really a boy at all, not in the moral sense. That he belonged to a category outside the ordinary. Born wrong. naturally depraved, a bad seed. That belief was comforting in a poisonous way. It implied the rest of society could stay safe as long as it could identify and isolate the bad ones. The language of early psychology. This was also an era when people were increasingly tempted to medicalize what frightened them. Victorians were beginning to talk more openly about the mind, about moral insanity, about degeneracy, about hereditary weakness, about the possibility that someone could appear rational and still lack the internal breaks that make cruelty feel unbearable. So Robert's calmness, if calmness is truly what it was, became a kind of exhibit. Not just a boy to punish, but a specimen to interpret. And interpretation, when it's done in public, becomes performance. The press could not just say, "A boy did something terrible." It had to tell readers what kind of boy he was. So he became, depending on the writer's agenda, a product of sensational fiction, a warning about modern parenting, proof that children needed stricter discipline, evidence that society was decaying, a case study in abnormal psychology. In every version, the details of the locked room did the heavy lifting, because nothing else so perfectly symbolized the fear that a child could rearrange reality around a horror and keep going. What we can say, and what we can't. We can't know with certainty what Robert felt in those days. Any claim to full access would be fiction. But we can name the most plausible psychological realities that coexist in cases like this, without softening the horror. Denial as survival, a child's mind refusing to hold the full meaning at once. Compartmentalization, upstairs isn't real if the door is shut. Thrill plus escape, the intoxicating sensation of rulelessness after an authoritarian presence disappears. Emotional flattening, shock that doesn't look like panic, sometimes it looks like blankness. A child's distorted time, thinking in today and tomorrow, not forever. A secret shared, the strange glue that binds siblings when reality becomes unspeakable. None of these are excuses. They're attempts to describe how something so grotesque can be sustained by a child without immediate collapse. Because that's what the locked room represents, not just a dead body, but a mind holding the unholdable by turning it into an upstairs problem and choosing day after day not to open the door. The public's true fear. The Plaistow horror wasn't only a murder story. It was a story about a boundary failing, the boundary between the home and danger, between child and criminal, between innocence and knowledge, between boys will be boys, and boys will do anything. And because it threatened that boundary, the case didn't simply make people sad. It made them afraid of their own houses, afraid of their own children, afraid of what could be happening upstairs while life carried on downstairs. Chapter 9. What was missing? When people tried to explain the Plaistow horror, they reached instinctively for excess. Too much imagination. Too much stimulation. Too much freedom. Too much modernity. Too much of everything. Almost no one asked whether something essential was absent. Because absence is harder to dramatize. It doesn't announce itself with blood or headlines. It looks like small neglects layered over time, like a hunger that becomes background noise. It looks like children learning very early that no one is coming to regulate the temperature of their lives. In other words, it looks boring. And boredom is not how Victorian England liked to frame evil. Hunger is not always about food. The Coombes boys were not starving in the literal sense. They were fed. They were clothed. They went to school. From the outside, the household met the minimum requirements of care. But hunger isn't only caloric. There is a kind of hunger that comes from living without reliable emotional regulation, without someone who can absorb your distress and hand it back to you in a manageable shape. A hunger that grows when authority is present but inconsistent, when illness erodes predictability, when grief rearranges the household without explanation. Emily Coombes was often unwell. That matters. Chronic illness in a parent doesn't just remove energy, it removes availability. Children learn, quietly, not to bring problems forward. They learn to self-manage too early. They learn that adults are fragile, that asking too much is dangerous. They also learn sometimes that rules exist without flexibility, that authority appears as command rather than care. And when that authority vanishes suddenly, the result is not always grief. Sometimes it's relief. Relief is one of the most socially unacceptable emotions a child can feel toward a parent, especially a mother. So it gets buried, disguised, or split off entirely. But it exists. And when relief appears without containment, it can metastasize into something unrecognizable. The locked room as psychological object. The locked door upstairs wasn't just hiding a body. It was doing psychological work. It turned the unbearable into something concrete and manageable. Don't go there. Children understand that rule instinctively. It's simple. It doesn't require emotional processing. In trauma psychology, this is sometimes called externalization, the mind putting something intolerable outside itself so it can keep functioning. Adults do this too. We put problems in drawers. We say, "I'll deal with that later." We compartmentalize. The difference is that adults usually have scaffolding, language, support, perspective, a future sense of consequence. Children don't. So the locked door becomes a stand-in for regulation itself. It says, "This is contained." And once something is contained, the child's nervous system is free to chase stimulation elsewhere. Hence the outings, the sandwiches, the theater, the cricket. These weren't celebrations. They were self-soothing. Pleasure as emergency medicine. There's a reason the boys didn't collapse into sobbing remorse immediately. Children don't process catastrophe by sitting still and reflecting. They process it by moving. They seek sensation because sensation grounds them back into the body. Sugar, noise, crowds, motion, all of these regulate a nervous system that has lost its anchor. To an adult observer, this looks monstrous. To a clinician, it looks like dysregulated survival. That doesn't make it okay. But it makes it human. What horrified Victorians was not just that the boys went out, it was that the city unknowingly became a substitute caregiver. London fed them stimulation when the house could no longer feed them structure. The city gave them what the home could not. Why the demon story was appealing. The idea of demons, corruption, or innate depravity does something very specific. It absolves the environment. If the boys were possessed, then no one has to ask what happens when children are left to manage the unmanageable alone. No one has to look at illness, grief, poverty, emotional absence, or the limits of maternal endurance. No one has to admit that children sometimes survive in ways that look appalling from the outside. Calling it evil is cleaner. Calling it hunger is terrifying, because hunger is common. What they needed, and didn't get. They needed interruption. They needed an adult to notice something was wrong and insist, not politely inquire. They needed someone to come upstairs. They needed someone to say no. This stops now. They needed regulation more than punishment in those first days, someone to take over the unbearable task of reality so they didn't have to keep managing it themselves. Instead, they had a locked door and a city that sold tickets without questions. And once the police arrived, the response swung hard in the opposite direction, not care but judgment, not containment but spectacle. Because by then, it was too late for sandwiches. Chapter 10, Science versus Sin. Once the confession existed, the story no longer belonged to Plaistow. It belonged to everyone. And as soon as a crime becomes everyone's, it stops being only a question of evidence and becomes a question of meaning. The public wanted a verdict, yes, but even more than that, it wanted an explanation that could repair the tear the case had made in the world. Because a 13-year-old killing his mother was terrifying. But a 13-year-old killing his mother and then carrying on, locking the door, spending money, taking outings, felt like something worse, not just violence, but a kind of emotional absence that threatened the Victorian belief that conscience was natural and automatic. So the case quickly turned into a debate with two competing languages, sin and science. And both sides were desperate to claim the boy. The moral story, wickedness. In the moral framing, Robert was not primarily a child. He was a warning. If a boy could do this, then something had gone wrong with the entire architecture of society, religion, discipline, parental authority, education, the home. The case became useful to people who were already convinced the modern world was corroding the old safeguards. In this telling, the locked room was proof of something like depravity, an unnatural hardening. Writers reached for words that turned a boy into a category. Depraved, callous, hardened, unnatural, without feeling, morally dead. The afterdays mattered here because they created the image of a boy who not only committed a wrong act but could live beside it. And for moral commentators, that capacity was not psychological. It was spiritual. If he could walk out to cricket while his mother lay upstairs, then, so the argument went, he must lack something fundamental. A soul properly formed. a conscience, a fear of God. In this framing, the solution was simple and brutal: punishment. Not only to deal with Robert, but to reassure society that order still existed, that the rules of the universe had not been overturned by a child with a knife. The scientific story: abnormality. But the late Victorian period was also hungry for a different kind of explanation, one that felt modern, rational, and in its own way merciful. This was the era when people increasingly believed that character could be studied, categorized, diagnosed. The mind was becoming a terrain for experts: doctors, psychologists in all but name, early criminologists. A boy like Robert was not only wicked. He was a specimen. Not in a cold-hearted way, at least not always. Sometimes scientific curiosity was driven by genuine fear. If you could understand what went wrong, you could prevent it happening again. But scientific explanation carried its own comfort. If the boy was abnormal, then ordinary families could feel safe. So experts and commentators began reaching for the language of mental disturbance and moral defect. Moral insanity, degeneracy, hereditary weakness, defective conscience, abnormal development. Victorians were fascinated by the idea that a person could be rational in speech yet defective in morality. That someone might know right from wrong and still feel little pressure to choose right. This concept, roughly what we might now call a profound disturbance in emotional regulation or empathy, was being discussed in the period under different names, none of them fully settled. The Coombes case offered a dramatic stage for that debate. Because what do you do with a child who can describe what he did without immediately dissolving? The scientific answer often became, he is not like other children. The body as evidence of mind. In cases involving adults, evidence is often physical: fingerprints, weapons, blood patterns. In this case, because the offenders were children and the motive was domestic, another kind of evidence took center stage: behaviour. The locked room was treated not only as practical concealment but as psychological evidence. The outings became not merely after-the-fact events but proof of a particular inner condition. Adults examined the boy's actions as if reading symptoms. Going to cricket became lack of remorse. Spending money became callous selfishness. Calm answers became cold calculation. Silence became deception. Youth became either mitigation or warning. Everything could be interpreted, and interpretation always reflected the interpreter's values. This is the uncomfortable truth about psychology in the public sphere: it often becomes morality wearing a lab coat. A Victorian anxiety, the child without fear. At the heart of the science versus sin debate was one terrifying question: what if some children do not fear what they should fear? In Victorian imagination, fear had a moral function. Fear of God. Fear of punishment. Fear of disgrace. These fears were supposed to help form conscience. But Robert's behaviour, especially the days after, suggested the possibility of a child moving through life with the ordinary breaks missing or disconnected. To Victorians, that was not just criminal. It was existential. Because if fear and conscience were not reliable, then the home could not guarantee safety. Education could not guarantee morality. Religion could not guarantee restraint. A child could become, suddenly, a stranger. Where the blame went. As the debate unfolded, blame radiated outward, because blame is what societies do when they feel helpless. Some blamed Emily, even as they mourned her, suggesting she was too ill, too strict, too weak, too absent. Victorians were skilled at blaming mothers for the actions of sons. Some blamed the father's absence. A household without a father was seen by many as structurally vulnerable, missing the proper authority figure. Some blamed the city, the streets, entertainment, cheap literature, anything that allowed children to form inner worlds beyond adult supervision. Some blamed heredity. The late Victorian obsession with bad stock and degeneracy allowed people to relocate horror into bloodlines rather than circumstances. The boy himself, meanwhile, became a surface onto which the era projected its fears. The truth that sits between. If we strip away the moral panic and the speculative diagnoses, we are left with something both simpler and harder. A boy did something violently irreversible. Then he did something psychologically uncanny. He kept living as if the locked door made it containable. This does not require demons. It does not require a neat medical label. It requires only a child mind faced with something too large: anger, resentment, fear, relief, shock, whatever mixture it was, and choosing the only form of control available: seal it off. The Victorian debate, science versus sin, was an attempt to take that unsettling reality and make it legible. To decide whether Robert should be treated as a wicked boy needing punishment, or an abnormal boy needing containment. And that debate would soon move from newspapers and parlors into the most formal theater of judgment the age possessed. The courtroom. The next chapter follows the case into trial, where law tries to do what morality and science could not do cleanly: decide in public what a child is responsible for, and what society is responsible for failing to provide. Chapter 11. The trial. By the time the case reached court, the public had already tried it a dozen different ways. In newspapers, Robert was a wicked boy. In drawing rooms, he was a symptom of modern decay. In moral tracts, he was a warning about lax discipline. In the language of early psychology, he was abnormal, an example of what happened when the mind's brakes didn't engage. And under all those versions ran the same, unbearable image. A locked room upstairs. A boy downstairs eating, sleeping, leaving, returning. As if the door itself had become his conscience. The courtroom was supposed to do what public panic could not: take all that noise and reduce it to a verdict. But courts don't like the questions this case raised. Courts like intention. They like motive. They like neat causality. They like adults. They do not like the unstable reality of a 13-year-old. A child in the dock. A Victorian courtroom was theatre, even when it pretended not to be. The ritual of it, robes, formal address, the strict choreography of standing and sitting, was designed to make judgment feel orderly. That order mattered because the crime had made the world feel disorderly. Robert was brought in not as a small child, but not yet as a man. He occupied the uncomfortable space that made everyone uneasy, old enough to be capable, young enough to be horrifying. This is where your point lands hard. If no one taught him how to regulate what surged inside him, anger, humiliation, fear, whatever lived there, then what the court was now trying to do was regulate it after the fact, with punishment and procedure. But regulation is not the same as understanding. What the court needed to decide. The law's question was blunt. Did he know what he was doing? Not was he sad. Not was he neglected. Not did he have emotional skills. The law narrowed all of human complexity to a single threshold: responsibility. In Victorian England, there was an established belief that children could be held accountable if they understood the nature of their act. But where exactly that line fell, especially at 13, was contested and emotionally charged. Because to punish a child as a full adult felt like savagery, and to treat a child murderer as simply a child felt like madness. So the trial was pulled between two fears: the fear of being too harsh, and the fear of being too lenient. Evidence as story. The prosecution did not need to invent a dramatic narrative. The facts carried their own weight. The body. The locked bedroom. The time that passed. The boy's movements through the city. The spending. The outings. The confession. Each fact was its own piece of theatre. Together, they formed a story the public could not stop watching. But in court, even facts become interpretation. Every detail is framed to suggest a certain kind of mind. The locked door becomes planning. The days become deliberate concealment. The outings become indifference. In a courtroom, after often matters as much as during, because it speaks to intent. And the case's most chilling feature, the continuing life beneath the corpse, was treated as a window into Robert's interior. The court was, in effect, being asked to decide: was this a child acting out in a storm? Or a child capable of sustaining cold denial? The question of the younger brother. Nathaniel's role hovered like a shadow at the edge of proceedings, because he represented everything the public did not want to face: that children can exist in the gravitational field of another child's violence, and that innocence can become complicated quickly in a sealed household. If Nathaniel was framed as victim, the story could preserve a moral hierarchy. If Nathaniel was framed as accomplice, the story became even more terrifying. Courtrooms, like societies, often prefer narratives that preserve the possibility of rescue. A younger brother can be rescued. The older brother can be punished. The world remains legible. What regulation looks like in court. This is the most bitter irony of your insight. If Robert lacked emotional regulation, the court was not going to teach it. The court's regulation is external. It is force, structure, consequence imposed from outside, handcuffs, verdict, sentence. It does not build inner brakes. It only answers the public's need for containment. And what the public wanted desperately was containment, because the case had shown what happens when children are, in a sense, left to contain themselves. The verdict that could not be clean. Victorian justice had a problem here. A 13-year-old could not easily be placed into the usual categories. An adult murderer could be hanged. A child could be disciplined. Robert was both child and murderer, and that combination short-circuited the emotional appetite for simple justice. So the verdict, whatever its exact phrasing, would land with a kind of uneasy compromise, the acknowledgement of guilt paired with a refusal, at least publicly, to treat him as fully grown. This is where Victorian society did something revealing. It chose institutional containment, not simply prison, something that sat between punishment and treatment. A place designed to remove a person from the world and hold them there, out of sight, until the danger felt distant again. What the trial really did. The trial did not only judge Robert. It judged the household. It judged the street. It judged London. It judged the era's anxieties about children and modern life. And it performed something the public needed more than truth. A sense that order had returned. Because once a verdict was spoken, the panic could be redirected. The case could be filed. The boys could be placed somewhere behind walls. The locked room could be replaced by a locked institution. But the psychological question, the one you're asking, the one parents feel in their bones, did not go away. How does a child become capable of living beside something that should be unbearable? The next chapter moves into that institutional answer, where Victorian England put Robert, what they hoped those walls would do, and what happens when a wicked boy grows up inside containment. Chapter 12. Containment. Victorian England loved a wall. Not only the literal kind, brick, iron, barred windows, but the idea of a wall, a structure that could separate danger from decency, disorder from order, the troubling from the everyday. When a crime made society feel porous, the instinct was to build something firm. And after the verdict, that instinct had a destination. Robert was not simply punished. He was contained. Because what frightened people wasn't only what he had done. It was what the case implied, that a child could commit an act that should shatter him and then keep moving, calmly, outwardly intact, apparently unbroken. That kind of child did not fit neatly into a prison narrative. A prison was for men. The gallows was for monsters. The schoolroom was for boys. So the solution became something else, an institution designed for those who unsettled categories. A place where the walls did the regulating society feared the boy lacked. The Victorian faith in institutions. The 19th century was an age of institutions. When society did not know what to do with a person, it built a building. It created a category. It staffed the category with uniforms and rules. It called the result science, or reform, or treatment. The workhouse for poverty. The asylum for madness. The reformatory for delinquency. The prison for crime. The spaces were different, but the logic was the same. Remove the problem from view and claim progress through order. For a child like Robert, the question was not simply how long, but what is he? Wicked? Ill? Corrupted? Degenerate? Salvageable? Victorian institutions allowed the state to avoid answering cleanly. They were, in a sense, ambiguity made architectural. What containment promised? Containment promised three things the public craved. Safety. He could not harm anyone else if he was behind walls. Meaning. If he was placed in an institution associated with abnormality, society could tell itself he was not an ordinary child. He was a special case. A deviation. Reassurance. The existence of the institution implied competence. We have a system for this. It is a subtle social trick. A building becomes proof that the world remains governable. But a building cannot answer the deeper question, what does a child become when his development unfolds inside walls? The child inside the system. To be 13 and placed into institutional life is to be reshaped. Rules replace family. Routine replaces relationship. Authority is constant and impersonal. Privacy is reduced. Even the body is regulated, when to wake, when to eat, when to speak, when to be silent. For some children, this kind of structure can feel stabilizing at first, especially if home was chaotic, ill, unpredictable. Structure can mimic safety. It can mimic the external regulation a child never learned internally. For others, It becomes a pressure cooker. But for Robert, the story becomes psychologically strange in another way. Society had interpreted his calmness as proof of something wrong inside him. So the institution was tasked, implicitly, with doing two contradictory things. Contain the danger. Create a conscience. The first is easy. Locks work. The second is not. You cannot manufacture remorse like you manufacture discipline. Punishment versus care, the Victorian mix. Victorian containment was rarely pure treatment. It was punishment with a medical vocabulary. Even when the system claimed compassion, it was built on suspicion and control. The child's inner life mattered only insofar as it could be managed. Reform often meant obedience. Improvement often meant silence. And yet, within that harshness, Victorian institutions did sometimes provide what some households could not: regular meals, predictability, supervision. That uncomfortable truth is part of why this case keeps pulling at modern nerves. Because if emotional regulation was missing at home, institutional order might imitate regulation from the outside. But imitation is not the same as growth. A child can become compliant without becoming well. The public's hunger for a monster. Even after Robert vanished behind walls, the public did not release him easily. Newspapers and commentators returned to him as a figure of fascination. The case remained useful because it was not only criminal, it was symbolic. It could be invoked whenever society wanted to talk about bad boys, corrupted youth, modern moral decline. And the locked room remained the central symbol. It turned into a kind of recurring nightmare image, the boy who could live with the body upstairs. Even if Robert changed inside the institution, public imagination did not. Public imagination froze him at 13, forever walking under that locked door. This is something true crime often reveals. Punishment satisfies one appetite, but fascination satisfies another. What Nathaniel represented. Meanwhile, Nathaniel, if treated as less culpable, represented the other appetite, the desire for rescue. Victorian society liked rescue stories. Rescue allowed moral order to be restored. One boy falls, one boy is saved, the family tragedy becomes a lesson rather than a crack in reality. And yet Nathaniel had also lived in the house. He had also walked under that locked door. Whatever his legal status, his psyche had been shaped by proximity to something unspeakable. Containment, then, wasn't only physical. It was social. The older boy contained behind walls. The younger boy contained by a story of innocence. Both containments served public comfort. Neither fully addressed what it meant to be those boys. What containment really was. If you strip away the Victorian vocabulary, reform, treatment, degeneracy, moral insanity, you're left with the simplest truth. Society could not tolerate what the case suggested about childhood. So it built walls around the boy who embodied that suggestion. Walls are society's way of saying, we are safe again. But you can't wall off an idea. The Plaistow horror had introduced a new fear into the Victorian imagination, that childhood could be opaque, that conscience could fail to form, that domestic life could hold atrocity without visible collapse. No institution could undo that fear. It could only hide the boy. After the walls. What happens to a child who grows up behind walls is not a neat story. It is not a redemption arc designed for comfort. It is years of routine and surveillance, the slow reshaping of identity under authority, and eventually, release into a world that remembers the headline even if the person has changed. The next chapter follows that long shadow, what became of Robert after the case faded from front pages, and what it means to try to live a normal life after being turned, at 13, into a national symbol of unnaturalness. Chapter 13, Growing Up After Murder. It is tempting to end the story at the walls. To treat the institution as a full stop, a sealed conclusion, the boy removed, the danger contained, the moral order restored. That is what Victorian society wanted, to shut the door on the case the way the boys had shut the door upstairs. But stories don't end when the public stops looking. They simply become quieter. And in the quiet, something difficult happens. A child becomes an adult. A notorious boy becomes a man. And the question shifts from punishment to something far more unsettling. What does a life look like after a crime that should have ended it? Time doesn't heal, it reorganizes. Inside an institution, time is thick. Days repeat. Weeks become indistinguishable. The outside world changes without you. Seasons arrive as minor variations in light and temperature rather than in freedom. The self adapts. For a child, adaptation is not optional, it is instinct. Children learn what their environment demands and grow around it. That is the raw truth at the heart of human development. We are shaped by what we live inside. So Robert grew up inside containment. Whatever his inner life had been at 13, whatever mix of shock, anger, denial, relief, fear, those emotions would not have remained static. They would have been processed, suppressed, argued with, reinterpreted, rewritten. Not necessarily into moral clarity, but into survival. Because even guilt can become routine if it must. And even horror can become background if it cannot be escaped. The public myth versus the private person. Outside the walls, Robert was fixed in public imagination. People remembered the headline, "Boy murders mother, leaves body upstairs, goes on holiday." That version of him did not age. It stayed 13 forever, frozen under the locked door. But inside the walls, the actual person aged. He grew taller. His voice changed. His face changed. The boyishness that made the crime so shocking slowly disappeared, replaced by features that made him look like any other man. And with that change came a strange psychological tension. The very thing that had made the case unbearable to Victorians, his youth, was also the thing time erased first. It is easier to imagine evil in a child because it feels like the corruption of something sacred. It is easier to accept crime in an adult because it fits the categories we already have. Robert's aging, then, was not only personal. It was a kind of social relief. The boy who had shaken the era was becoming a man who could be placed back into the ordinary world of adult wrongdoing and adult consequences. The case could fade. The horror could be reassigned to the past. What reform could mean. Victorian reformers liked the idea that institutions could transform people. That was part of the moral comfort they sold, the belief that even the troubling could be corrected if subjected to routine, discipline, and supervision. For some, this was sincere idealism. For others, it was simply a way to make control sound humane. But reform is not always moral transformation. Sometimes it is behavioral transformation. A person can learn to follow rules without learning to feel. A person can become compliant without becoming whole. And yet it would be lazy, and emotionally dishonest, to assume that no internal change occurred. Human beings do not remain 13 forever inside their minds. Even the most frightening child grows, encounters consequences, experiences isolation, experiences shame or defiance or numbness or some shifting combination. There is no single trajectory. There is only what can be endured. Release and the problem of a new life. When Robert eventually returned to the world outside, the problem he faced was not only practical, work, identity, social acceptance. It was existential. Because how do you live after becoming, in the public imagination, a symbol? How do you build an ordinary day on top of an extraordinary past? How do you wake, eat, laugh, travel, ordinary acts, after your name has been fused to the image of a locked room upstairs? This is the haunting mirror of the case, the very normality that made the aftermath so creepy. His ability to go on becomes later the only way survival is possible. To live, he would have had to carry the story and not carry it at the same time. That sounds impossible until you remember that people do this constantly. Survivors of violence, perpetrators, witnesses, families, human beings are remarkably capable of holding unbearable knowledge and still buying bread, still taking trains, still making tea. What makes us recoil here is that the knowledge was created by his own hand. The adult mind and the child act. One of the most difficult psychological questions in crimes committed by children is this: does the adult remain responsible for the child's act in the same way an adult is responsible for an adult act? Legally, society tends to say yes, because without that, there is no stable idea of accountability. But psychologically, the question is more complicated, because child minds are not simply smaller adult minds. They are developing systems. They do not feel time the same way. They do not foresee the same way. They do not regulate emotion the same way. They do not always understand consequence in a durable form. That doesn't erase moral responsibility, but it changes the texture of what living with it might mean. An adult can revisit the moment and understand it in language. A child may remember it in fragments, sensations, a sequence of images that returns like a dream. As Robert grew, he would have had to integrate the act into a self that no longer felt like the self who did it. That is the curse of growing up after childhood violence. You become someone else, but you cannot outrun what the earlier self did. Living with a locked door inside the mind. The locked room upstairs becomes, in the long view, a metaphor for something many people do, not only criminals. You lock away what you cannot bear. You don't open the door. You keep living downstairs. Victorian society was horrified because it saw this behavior as unnatural. But in truth, it is one of the most human survival mechanisms there is. The difference is that in most lives, what is locked away is grief, shame, trauma, things done to us. In Robert's case, what was locked away was something he did. That difference matters morally. But psychologically, the mechanism can look eerily similar. Lock it away. Don't open it. Keep moving. What we can't know. We cannot truly know, whether Robert felt remorse later, or numbness, or rationalization, or any shifting blend of all three. Records can tell us what institutions did with him, where he went, what labels were applied. They cannot give us a reliable map of private conscience. That uncertainty frustrates modern readers because it prevents closure. But maybe that is the point. The case refuses closure because the human mind refuses tidy endings. A child did something horrific. Then he lived. Then he grew. Then he attempted to become ordinary. And the world, which had once needed him to be monstrous, eventually needed him to disappear into anonymity so that the boundary between us and him could be rebuilt. But the boundary was always thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Chapter 14, Robert after the Plaistow horror. The public always wants a story to end where the punishment begins. That's the emotional bargain of scandal. Lock him away, and we can all unclench. Victorian England tried to do exactly that with Robert Coombes, turn him into a cautionary tale, then put a wall around the tale. But time is a thief. It steals the neat shapes we make. The boy did not remain 13. He did not remain a headline. He did not remain in England. He became, uncomfortably and inexorably, a man. The years behind walls. Robert spent 17 years incarcerated, including time at Broadmoor, released at about age 30. Those are the years that would have made a person who was already psychologically unusual become even more difficult to read. Adolescence and early adulthood lived under supervision, routine, and institutional authority. If your instinct is he never learned emotional regulation, then here's the bitter irony. Institutions don't teach regulation the way healthy attachment does. They teach compliance. They teach containment. They teach don't do that again, but not necessarily, here's what to do with the part of you that wants to explode. So when he left, he didn't walk out as a boy forgiven. He walked out as a man shaped by control. The Vanishing Act, Australia. After release, Robert did what many people with impossible reputations do, he left. He emigrated to Australia in early 1914, following his brother, who had gone ahead during Robert's imprisonment. This is where the story shifts into something almost eerie in its ordinariness. Once he was far enough away from London's memory, he could try on a life that wasn't built entirely out of the locked room upstairs. War and a new narrative. In Australia, Robert enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force early in the First World War. He later received the Military Medal. There's an uncomfortable psychological truth here. War gives men a socially sanctioned place to put violence, bravery, endurance, and suffering. It provides structure and meaning. It hands you an identity the public can respect. For someone like Robert, someone whose earliest fame was bound to horror, war offered a different kind of story to live inside. Not redemption, exactly, but replacement. Work, quiet living, and the attempt at normal. After the war, he lived in New South Wales and worked in ordinary grounded ways, farm work around Nana Glen, teaching music locally, and later running a market garden in the Glenray district. This is the afterlife part people rarely sit with in true crime, the slow, practical labor of continuing. Growing vegetables, teaching notes, paying rent, turning days into something that looks like normal time. Marriage, children, family. Here's what we can say accurately. He never married. He had an adopted son, and left him his estate. He died at Coffs Harbour Hospital on May 7, 1949, aged 67, and is buried in Coffs Harbour Historic Cemetery, NSW. The adopted son detail matters psychologically. It suggests some kind of capacity for attachment, legacy, or at least responsibility, though we should be careful. Adoption can mean many things, and we don't get to invent sentiment where the record is silent. But it does complicate the monster story. Because monsters don't plant gardens and raise children, at least not in the way society imagines monsters. What his afterlife means. Robert's adult life doesn't erase the Plaistow horror. Nothing can. But it does force the reader to confront something more frightening than a demon story. A person can commit something unthinkable at 13 and still spend decades trying to build an ordinary life. That's not forgiveness. That's not absolution. It's simply the brutal fact that human lives continue, even after the worst thing. And under that fact sits your gut-level reaction: how could he just keep going? Sometimes the most accurate answer is also the most unbearable one, because he could. Chapter 15, Nathaniel, Under the Shadow of Robert. Nathaniel's story only makes sense after Robert's, because Nathaniel lived his entire life in the wake of an act he did not commit, but could not escape. He was the younger brother, the one the public wanted to rescue so the story could keep a moral shape: one damned, one saved. In 1895, Nathaniel was found not guilty of murdering their mother. Legally, that was the end of his culpability. Psychologically, it was the beginning of his burden. The brother who lived with it too. Nathaniel lived in the house. He walked under the locked door. He traveled with Robert afterward. Even if he never raised the knife, he inhabited the same sealed reality for those days, the same don't open the door rule that turned horror into something postponed. This is the part the public doesn't like. The younger sibling in these stories is rarely a clean symbol. He is usually a child adapting to an older child's will, fear, shock, loyalty, and the strange glue that forms when two children share a secret too big for a child to hold. Nathaniel's silence, whatever its source, was part of how the aftermath lasted. Australia, distance as survival. At some point before Robert's arrival in 1914, Nathaniel emigrated to Australia. Later summaries note the brothers were reunited there. Australia offered what England could not. Distance from the nickname. Distance from the neighbours remembering. Distance from the moral panic that had turned two boys into a national nightmare. War service and a life that kept moving. Biographical summaries of the brothers' later lives record that Nathaniel served in the First World War and was a chief stoker on HMAS Australia. He died in Newcastle, New South Wales in 1946. And here's the cold human symmetry: both brothers ended up in the same country. Both served in wartime structures. Both lived long enough for the Victorian horror story to become history. But history doesn't mean the nervous system forgets. The question Nathaniel had to live with. Nathaniel's life carries the quiet question that follows siblings through catastrophe: why him, and not me? Not only why did he do it, but why was Robert the one who crossed the line? Why did Nathaniel follow afterward? What did he believe he was doing in those days beneath the locked door, surviving, obeying, hiding, denying? We cannot answer that cleanly. But we can write it honestly. Nathaniel's afterlife wasn't a separate story from Robert's. It was a parallel track, one that had to carry the same origin point, whether the world named it or not. Chapter 16, The Brothers as Men. There are endings that feel clean on paper: trial, sentence, institution, silence. But the Coombes story refuses that kind of ending, because the two surviving figures in it did not vanish into separate worlds forever. They re-entered proximity. They became men on the same continent, carrying the same origin point like a scar that can't be seen unless you know where to look. Reunion without resolution. When Robert arrived in Australia in early 1914, he was not stepping into a blank new life. He was stepping towards something already living there. Nathaniel, his younger brother, no longer the boy beneath the locked door, but a grown man with his own routines, his own memories, his own way of surviving. The reunion itself is one of the most haunting facts of the case, not because it is dramatic, but because it is possible. It forces the reader to accept that human beings can live forward even when they have lived through what should make forward movement impossible. Did they speak of their mother? Did Nathaniel ask questions he couldn't ask at 12? Did Robert ever say the words that the public wanted, "I'm sorry"? Or did the entire subject become another locked room, shifted from a Plaistow staircase into the private architecture of adult silence? We can't know. But we can name what the reunion suggests: that whatever happened between them after 1895, the bond of blood remained stronger than the story the public wanted to tell, stronger, at least, than the urge to sever completely. Two versions of survival. Robert's survival was always uncanny because it came wrapped in that image of continuation: the locked door upstairs, the outings, the holiday-like days. In Australia, the continuation took a different form. He worked. He lived quietly. He enlisted. He grew older. He tried, at least outwardly, to become ordinary, something Victorians could not imagine for the boy they had turned into a symbol. Nathaniel's survival was quieter still. He was the one who didn't hold the knife, which meant society tried to write him into a cleaner category: spared, rescued, innocent. But innocence, after the locked room, is not a thing that returns intact. If Robert's story is about a failure of regulation, of breaks, of stopping, then Nathaniel's is about what happens to the child beside the failure. The one who learned, in the most brutal way possible, that reality can be sealed off and lived beneath. Two brothers, then, carrying two different burdens. Robert carrying the act. Nathaniel carrying the proximity. War as structure. Both brothers entered the machinery of war. War offered the one thing their origin story had denied them: a socially sanctioned structure strong enough to hold male intensity, fear, aggression, numbness, adrenaline, without asking too many questions about where those emotions came from. In peacetime, a man like Robert is a problem to interpret. In wartime, men become useful. War does not ask whether you learned emotional regulation in childhood. It gives you drills, rules, hierarchies, external discipline, the same architecture, in a different uniform, as the institutions that had already shaped Robert. For Nathaniel, war offered something else: a life with a clear role, a clear purpose, a clear identity that did not require him to be the brother of. Uniforms are powerful like that. They can overwrite headlines. The quiet lives that followed. After the war, the brothers moved into the slow grind of ordinary time. This is where true crime becomes most unsettling, because the world that felt split in 1895, death upstairs, life downstairs, collapses back into one world again, one where a man buys groceries, teaches music, grows vegetables, reads newspapers, gets sick, grows old. Robert did not marry. He did not build a conventional family around himself. Yet he adopted a son, an act that, at minimum, suggests a wish for continuity, for legacy, for some version of the future that isn't purely solitary. Nathaniel lived his own life, his own aging, his own ending. And somewhere in those decades, the Victorian horror story became just that: Victorian, distant, sepia-toned, something people could speak of as history, safely sealed away from their own kitchens and staircases. But for the brothers, it was never sepia. It was a first memory. The locked room moves inside. Here is the thing the case teaches, if you look at it without moral theater. People don't always collapse under what they've done or seen. Sometimes they do something worse, something colder, something more unnerving. They adapt. They build walls inside the mind. They keep going. The locked door in Plaistow was wood and iron. In Australia, the locked door would have been quieter, the topics not spoken of, the memories not entered, the emotional rooms kept shut because opening them would destroy whatever functioning life had been built downstairs. This is not forgiveness. It is not redemption. It is human survival, which can look horrifying when you place it beside the thing survived. The mother who vanishes from the men's story. The cruelest part, if you stay with it, is Emily. She is the center of the case, and yet the world moved on without her. Her sons lived into old age. The press moved to other scandals. London became modern. And she remained, in record and memory, as a woman upstairs behind a locked door. In the public narrative, she often becomes an object: victim, mother, body, symbol. In real life, she was a person, fatigued, sick, trying to keep a household upright, trying to raise boys in a world that offered little softness to women. The brothers' afterlives, war, work, aging, do not restore her. They simply underline the imbalance that death always creates. The dead are fixed, the living keep moving. What the case leaves us with. In the end, the Plaistow horror does not resolve into a neat moral. It leaves you with a set of questions that feel modern precisely because they refuse comfort. What does a child do with feelings too large to hold? What happens when a home cannot regulate the people inside it? What does conscience look like when it fails to form in the way society expects? And what does survival look like when it's built on a locked door? The brothers became men. The headlines faded. But the case remains, because it exposed something we still don't like to admit. Sometimes the most frightening thing is not the explosion. It's the calm afterward. It's the way life continues downstairs. Epilogue: the house after. A house does not keep a headline. It keeps paint, dust, worn steps, the soft damage of years. It keeps the dents of furniture moved and removed. It keeps the faint logic of lives lived there, meals cooked, laundry dried, arguments that once felt enormous and now belong to nobody. And yet some houses, whether they deserve it or not, become containers for stories larger than themselves. The Coombes house became one of those. Not because it was grand. Not because it was unusual. But because it revealed something unbearable inside an ordinary domestic shape, that a home can hold atrocity without immediately falling apart. When Emily Coombes died upstairs, the house did not explode into chaos. It absorbed the act. The boys continued downstairs. The front door opened and closed. The street stayed quiet. For days, reality remained sealed behind a lock. That is why this case persists. Not because of blood. Because of the door. What became of the place? After the trial, the physical house returned to the world of property and rent, the dull mechanics of London life that swallow even the most dramatic events. Streets change names. Neighbors move. Children grow up and leave. The city thickens and modernizes. But the story does not disappear. It finds new hosts. People tell it in different tones depending on what they need, as morality tale, as sensational oddity, as cautionary story about children, as a case study in conscience. The details shift slightly in retelling, stories always do, but the core remains fixed. A mother dead upstairs. A door locked. Boys out enjoying themselves. That core is what people can't unsee. Why it still feels possessed. You joked about demons. But the reason demon language shows up around stories like this, even in modern mouths, is simple. When something feels psychologically unnatural, we reach for the supernatural. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is admitting that human minds, especially child minds, can sometimes do things that don't look like the morality stories we were raised on. That denial can be strong enough to sustain daily routine. That fear can be quiet. That shock can look like calm. That carrying on can happen not because a person is possessed, but because the mind will do almost anything to keep functioning. That doesn't make it less creepy. It makes it closer. And closeness is what frightens parents. What the Victorians really feared. The Victorians said they feared penny dreadfuls, urban corruption, modern life. But underneath those explanations was a simpler fear. That children are not transparent. That you can raise a boy, feed him, clothe him, teach him prayers and manners, and still not know what is forming behind the eyes. That the home, which was supposed to manufacture moral order, could fail. That the mother, which was supposed to be the center of safety, could become the center of catastrophe. The Coombes case was, for Victorians, a crack in the domestic myth. It suggested that the family could be the site not only of love and formation, but of annihilation, and that the world outside might not notice until the body insisted on being found. What it does to us now. The reason you reacted so viscerally is exactly the reason this case endures. It attacks the part of the brain that believes my home is different. Not in a judgmental way. In a protective way. Parents need to believe they would know. That something this wrong could not be happening under their roof without alarm bells blaring. This case says, sometimes the alarm bells are muffled by routine. Sometimes people interpret warning signs as mere oddness. Sometimes politeness delays intervention. Sometimes children can keep moving in ways that look terrifying from the outside. And when your child is the same age as Robert was, the imagination doesn't stay in the safe realm of history. It drifts toward what if. The only honest moral. There isn't a neat moral that makes this comfortable. If you try to make one, you either turn the boys into demons, which makes the story feel safely unreal, or you turn the mother into a lesson, which is a second cruelty to her. The only honest moral is the one that feels least satisfying. A child did something horrific. Adults rushed in after the fact to explain what they hadn't seen before. The state contained the boy. The brother lived under the shadow. And the world kept turning. What remains is not closure, but insight, unwelcome and valuable. That emotional regulation is not automatic. That homes can be fragile systems. That secrecy can be sustained by ordinary social habits. That the mind can lock doors inside itself and still buy sandwiches downstairs. Emily, finally named. True crime often revolves around perpetrators because they create narrative motion, what they did, where they went, what became of them. But the center of this story, the person who loses everything and never gets to speak again, is Emily Coombes. She becomes, in record and retelling, a body upstairs. This book has tried to resist that reduction, to remember her as more than the locked room. A woman managing illness, widowhood, boys on the edge of adolescence, a London that did not make life gentle for women. A person who lived in a respectable street with a life that deserved to continue. If the story has any ethical obligation, it is this: not to let the horror erase her humanity. The door we don't want to open. In the end, the locked room is both literal and symbolic. It is the thing we don't want to open in our own minds, the possibility that the most frightening events can occur not in distant alleys, but in familiar homes, not among strangers but among family, not announced by chaos, but hidden behind the ordinary rhythms of domestic life. We read cases like this because we want distance. And yet the act of reading collapses distance. It makes the past feel intimate. It makes a mother look like someone you could be. It makes a 13-year-old look like your son. That is why the case remains powerful. Not because it is common. Because it is possible. And because it forces us to confront, without comfort, the thinness of the line between the world we believe we live in and the one that can exist, quietly, behind a locked door. The house was not haunted. But it was human. And that is what makes it hardest to forget. Timeline of events. Before the crime. Winter 1891 to 1892, the Coombes family moved to 35, Cave Road, Plaistow, East London. 1893, July 1894, Robert changes schools, Stock Street, then Cave Street School. September 12, 1894 to March 11, 1895, Robert is absent from school. The school is told this was a sea voyage, later explained as a trip to New York. November 1894, Robert travels to attend the trial of James Canham Red, Southend murderer. The murder and discovery. Early hours, July 8, 1895, Emily Coombes is killed at 35, Cave Road, Plaistow, stabbed by her son Robert, 13. A key date consistently given in case summaries. July 8, 1895, later that day the crime is discovered and police become involved. Robert is taken into custody. Accounts describe police attending that afternoon. Arrest, trial, and sentencing. July 18, 1895, Robert is moved to Holloway Prison pending trial. September 9, 1895, trial begins at the Old Bailey, Central Criminal Court. September 1895, trial outcome: Robert is found guilty and sent to Broadmoor Hospital for the criminally insane. Nathaniel is found not guilty. Later life, Robert. 1912, Robert is released after 17 years, aged about 30. Early 1914, Robert emigrates to Australia. First World War, enlists early in the war. Robert serves with the Australian Imperial Force. June 25, 1916, AWM record shows a military medal recommendation for Robert Coombes, AIF. May 7, 1949, Robert dies, Coffs Harbour area, NSW, per standard summaries of his biography. Later life, Nathaniel. 1895, Nathaniel is acquitted, not guilty, at the Old Bailey proceedings alongside Robert's case. By 1914, Nathaniel is already in Australia. Sources describe Robert following him there. 1946, Nathaniel dies in Newcastle, New South Wales, as commonly recorded in biographical summaries. Bibliography. Primary sources and archival records. Old Bailey proceedings online. Robert Allen Coombes and Nathaniel Coombes, trial record, Central Criminal Court, September 1895. Australian War Memorial, AWM. Honours and Awards, Recommendation: Robert Coombes, Military Medal Recommendation File, dated June 25, 1916. Australian War Memorial, AWM. Honours and Awards, Robert Allen Coombes, Military Medal Entry with Gazette references. Trove, National Library of Australia. The Murder of a Mother reprinted report referencing the London proceedings, November 8, 1895. British Newspaper Archive, BNA. Search results for contemporary reporting on the Plaistow/Coombes case, including trial coverage and related articles, 1895. The Spectator, Archive. Commentary on the Plaistow Matricide case, September 21, 1895. Government and reference repositories used for verification. National Archives of Australia, NAA. Defense and War Service Records. Institute of Advanced Legal Studies, IALS, University of London. Guide/description of the Old Bailey Proceedings. Old Bailey Online. Secondary sources, selected. Summerscale, Kate. The Wicked Boy, The Mystery of a Victorian Child Murderer. Bloomsbury, 2016. Wikipedia contributors. Robert Coombes, murderer.